On Friday, December 5th, 1941, the front page of the Honolulu Star-Bulletin featured a story about the ongoing negotiations between the United States and Japan under the headline, "Further Peace Efforts Urged." In the harbor, the home of the United States Pacific Fleet, ships came and went in a way that might have seemed routine, were it not for what we now know was coming. While the United States was still neutral, the war was not far from the minds of the public, nor the Navy on December 5th, 1941. Headlines of the day were dominated by war news. The UK had declared war on Finland, Hungary, and Romania. The Russians were counterattacking. But the diplomatic standoff between the Japanese and Americans was also in the news. U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had sent a list of questions to the Japanese regarding a troop buildup in French Indochina. It was a culmination of years of rising tensions that had resulted in a U.S. embargo. The Japanese saw the questions as an ultimatum. The Honolulu Star-Advertiser reported that a Pacific Zero Hour was near, but the Star-Bulletin story began, "A Japanese government spokesman expressed belief today that the United States and Japan will continue with sincerity to try and find a common formula for a peaceful situation in the Pacific." That was not, however, the case. Hull had sent his note to Japan on November 26th, and the same day the Japanese fleet had left the Kuril Islands on its way to attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The Office of the Historian of the U.S. Department of State explains. Faced with serious shortages as a result of the embargo, unable to retreat and convinced that the U.S. officials opposed further negotiations, Japan's leaders came to the conclusion that they had to act swiftly. For their part, U.S. leaders had not given up on a negotiated settlement and also doubted that Japan had the military strength to attack the U.S. territory. But that doesn't mean that the Navy didn't understand that there was a very real possibility of war. The website of the National Museum of World War II Aviation explains, after the conclusion of Fleet Problem 21 naval exercise on May 17, 1940, the fleet was ordered to remain in Hawaii as a signal to Japan. Admiral James O. Richardson, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, strongly objected, saying the Pacific Fleet would be the prime target of an attack by Japan. Richardson later testified to Congress that he warned the president in October of 1940 that, in his opinion, the presence of the fleet in Hawaii might influence a civilian political government, but that Japan had a military government, which knew that the fleet was undermanned, unprepared for war, and had no training or auxiliary ships without which it could not undertake active operations. Richardson believed the fleet would be better prepared at the more comprehensive facility in San Pedro, California. But the website of the National World War II Museum explains, the president wanted it at Pearl Harbor, and there it would remain, despite even the War Department arguing to send the fleet back to California. In response to his opposition, Richardson was relieved of his position as Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet and replaced by Admiral Husband Kimmel. Regardless, however, the fleet was in Pearl Harbor as an attempt to deter Japanese aggression, even though the National World War II Museum explains, as even Army war planners knew, the fleet's presence in Hawaii had become a bluff and was doing the fleet more harm than good. But that doesn't mean that the fleet was not preparing for the possibility of action. There was a constant training schedule. The website of Pearl Harbor National Memorial writes of the battleship USS Arizona. Arizona would continue training and preparing for a coming conflict against Japan that many expected, but still hoped would never come. In October, Battleship Division 1, consisting of Arizona, along with Oklahoma and Nevada, went on fleet maneuvers, practicing techniques to avoid submarines. The division sailed again on December 1st for night fire exercises, held December 4th. The Naval History and Heritage Command explains afterwards, all three ships moored at Keys along Ford Island on 5 December. It was typical to do training during the week and return to the port for the weekend. That was one reason that the Japanese planned their attack for a Sunday. If the division had done their exercises on the weekend, the three ships, all of which would be sunk in the Japanese attack, might not have been at those Keys. But there was more coincidence. In fact, the three battleships might not have been in Hawaii at all, except for the fact that one admiral did not like them. Battleship Division 1 was part of Task Force 2, which included the carrier USS Enterprise, under the command of Vice Admiral William Halsey. While the Navy had been criticized for not anticipating the attack, in fact they did. They just misunderstood the target. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark had written a letter on November 7th to Kimmel that stated, "Neither President Franklin Roosevelt nor Secretary of State Cordell Hull would be surprised over a Japanese surprise attack." Tim Comerford of the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command noted in 2014, as the Japanese Imperial Navy strike group steamed toward Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy was preparing to fend off a suspected amphibious attack by their former ally, just about everywhere but Pearl Harbor. As a result, on November 28th, Halsey had been sent on a top-secret mission to use Enterprise to deliver aircraft from the 2nd Marine Aviation Wing to Wake Island. To cover the mission when the task group left, it was under the cover of conducting routine exercises. Halsey, who believed battleships to be outdated and too slow, elected not to take his battleships with him. He later explained, Task Force 2 sortied from Pearl Harbor at 7 a.m. on November 28th. When we were clear of the channel, I split off Enterprise, 3 heavy cruisers, and 9 destroyers, and designated them Task Force 8. I then directed the second senior in command in Task Force 2, Rear Admiral Milo F. Dremel, to take charge of our 3 battleships and remaining cruisers and destroyers and proceed to the drill grounds for normal work, while Task Force 8 stood to eastward as a feint. The decision to split Task Force 8 had been threshed out in conference the day before. Our reasoning was, 1, we had to sortie with the battleships to create an illusion that this was only a routine exercise, but 2, the planes had to reach Wake as soon as possible, and 3, the 17-knot battleships not only would be a drag on the 30-knot Enterprise cruisers and destroyers, but would give us little protection if we met the Japanese fleet, in which event our greatest safety lay in speed. Battleship Division 1 was left behind to preserve the cover and conduct exercises. Had they accompanied Halsey, they would not have been at those keys on December 7th. But there was still another coincidence for the ill-fated USS Arizona. The memorial website writes of the crew of Arizona. USS Arizona steamed gracefully into Pearl Harbor. She wouldn't be in port long, and many crewmen were excited to get in a last bit of liberty in Hawaii before the ship was due to depart for the mainland. Some planned to attend the Battle of Music at Block Arena. Others prepared for a football game against the crew of USS Pennsylvania, and a few simply wished to enjoy the sun and sand or maybe take care of some last-minute Christmas shopping downtown. The Arizona, soon to represent the nation's tragic entry into the war, was scheduled to leave for the mainland for a refit on December 8th. Her great loss, the result of a single day. And even worse, the memorial explains, Arizona was never supposed to be in Pearl Harbor that weekend. During the exercise in October, while executing a 90-degree turn, the Oklahoma had mistimed the turn. The memorial website explains, during a routine maneuvering exercise, the battleship USS Oklahoma missed a turn and crashed into the Arizona. The collision punched a 30-foot hole into the side of the ship, and the Arizona took on a list to port. Both ships made it back to Pearl Harbor, and the damage was quickly repaired. But the Arizona's departure had been delayed, and it was now decided that instead of heading directly to Bremerton, she would first visit her home port of San Pedro, California, so her crew could go on leave for the Christmas holiday. As such, a new date of departure was set, December 8th, 1941. If coincidence left Arizona in harm's way on December 7th, fate also meant that other ships were not there. Famously, the aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet were absent on December 7th. While some have tried to argue that the missing aircraft carriers was evidence that the administration had been forewarned of the attack, in fact, coincidence is the far more likely explanation. Robert Farley wrote in the National Interest last year, "The presence of carriers at Pearl was a function of Washington's anticipation of war. Higher war tensions produced more missions, which made it less likely that the Imperial Japanese Navy could catch one or more of the carriers in the attack." There were 3 carriers assigned to the Pacific Fleet. USS Saratoga had undergone scheduled dry dock in the Puget Sound Naval Yard at Bremerton. On December 7th, the ship had arrived in San Diego, where it was to embark its air group and head for Hawaii. In fact, the plan was for the ship to ferry a second group of Marine planes to Wake Island following the Enterprise's mission. As with Arizona, the fate of Saratoga at Pearl Harbor was a matter of but a few days. Meanwhile, the anticipation of war had also kept the remaining 2 carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Lexington, out of harm's way. Comerford explains, on November 26, Kimmel received an order from the Navy Department concerning reinforcement of Wake and Midway Islands. In order to keep the planes of the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing available for the expeditionary use, OPNAV has requested and Army has agreed to station 25 Army pursuit planes at Midway and a similar number at Wake, provided you consider this feasible and desirable. It will be necessary for you to transport these planes and ground crews from Oahu to these stations on an aircraft carrier. The tasks carried out by the carriers were themselves preparations for war, but the carriers were themselves prepared as well. Retired U.S. Navy Captain R.C. Gillette noted in a 1997 edition of the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute Press. Critics charged that the Navy's high commanders ignored warnings of a surprise attack and failed to be at a proper degree of readiness. Nothing could be further from the truth, however, at least as far as these 2 carrier task groups were concerned. Both routinely went to general quarters an hour before and an hour after sunrise and sunset, and shifted to a readiness condition 3 alert watch. As mentioned earlier, Enterprise, under Halsey's command, had ferried planes to Wake Island. He was fully aware of the risk of war. Logan Nye explains on the military website We Are the Mighty in 2023. Halsey took the carrier Enterprise, 3 heavy cruisers and 9 destroyers as Task Force 8 to deliver the planes, and those 13 ships would proceed under war conditions. Halsey said, I sent a general signal to Task Force 8, directing that warheads be placed on all torpedoes immediately, that all planes be armed with bombs or torpedoes, and that they carry their full allowance of ammunition. I ordered further that the pilots were to sink any shipping sighted and shoot down any plane encountered. I had been informed, of course, that no American or Allied shipping was in the waters I had to traverse. It was a surprising command for a nation that was not yet at war. Halsey noted that his operations officer, Commander William H. Burracker, protested. God damn it, Admiral, you can't start a private war on your own. Who's going to take the responsibility? I replied, I'll take it. If anything gets in my way, we'll shoot first and argue afterwards. Enterprise and her planes did not encounter any Japanese ships or aircraft, but again coincidence would come into play. The mission was completed on December 4th. Enterprise and the 13 ships of her group were supposed to return to Pearl Harbor on December 6th. Once again, fate intervened. On December 5th, the day that Battleship Division 1 returned to Pearl Harbor, Halsey and his task force ran into heavy seas, forcing him to slow his speed. Then one of his destroyers suffered damage from the storm, splitting a seam and further slowing the group. Instead of returning on the 6th, the group now planned to arrive the morning of the 7th. Nye writes, because of that single, slightly odd occurrence, 13 less ships, including one of America's most valuable carriers, were present when the Japanese attack began. The fleet was delayed further by difficulty fueling at sea. When the attack commenced, she was still 200 miles from Pearl Harbor. The third carrier, USS Lexington, was also not there, and once again coincidence intervened. On December 5th, as the battleships returned and Halsey was delayed, Lexington left on a mission of its own. Gillette explains, the Lexington left Pearl Harbor the morning of December 5th as part of Task Group 11, commanded by Rear Admiral John Henry Newton. On board were a squadron of Marine aviators and planes to reinforce those at Midway, and a group of naval aviators not yet carrier qualified. Lexington's mission would have had it away from Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack, but it still could have been in the fight. Gillette explains. Suddenly, one of the lookouts reported an aircraft on the horizon. The plane so spotted was quite likely from the Japanese fleet, as the anti-aircraft officer, Lieutenant Jerry O'Donnell, reasoned. Observations determined it to be a single-engine plane. Given the Lexington's location, it was clear to O'Donnell that it must be carrier-based. He recommended that aircraft be launched to investigate. However, it took more than an hour for the task group commander to reply, and when the response came, they were informed that the sighting was a PBY, twin-engine patrol plane, which O'Donnell and the Skyforward anti-aircraft crew found ridiculous. Despite protest, however, no further actions were taken. If the Lexington's aircraft sighting had been verified and her aircraft launched, Gillette argues, the results of the Pearl Harbor disaster would have been radically different. Gillette argues that the failure to follow up this sighting was actually a fortunate blunder, because if the Lexington had discovered the Japanese fleet, he argues they would have fought valiantly, but it would have been a futile effort against 6 Japanese carriers. And while that might have meant that Pearl Harbor would have been warned of the attack, he argues the defense likely would have been disorganized, and if the U.S. fleet had made it to sea, they might have been sunk in deep water, rather than at the Keys, where many of them could be recovered. It's difficult to rethink history. What if the battleships hadn't been there? What if the aircraft carriers had? We can only guess. I would love to hear your opinion, but one thing is sure. Were it not for a few coincidences in the comings and goings of the fleet on December 5th, 1941, the history of December 7th might have been different. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.